Right, well, let's move on from that story to more, of course, on what we've seen in the ANC election manifesto today, the promises from the ANC to improve the way that the state is managed, to improve services and to create jobs, a promise to finally implement a basic income grant. Basically, the social relief of distress grant would become a basic income grant. At the same time, of course, if you look at what the budget tells us about the state of our finances, a large proportion of the money that we have is spent on social grants, on dealing in debt, and on government wages. Professor Miriam Altman is a professor of practice at the University of Johannesburg. Professor Altman, good afternoon to you, and thank you for your time. If we look at the budget, what does it tell us about our finances? We seem to actually be spending a high proportion of the money that we have on debt, social grants, and on public workers. That must make it difficult to do anything else.
Well, look, year to year, that's how the budget's spent. The budget has economic services. It's got public employees who mostly deliver services like health and education and stuff like that, which, you'd expect there to be a very large complement of public servants in that. That's about a third of the budget, and it always is. And rightly so. It could be managed better. And social grants are an incredibly important service across the world, by the way. Because around the world, working class people and poor people can't make ends meet, even if in the United States, China, Brazil, and so on. It's always a balancing act in getting the balances right and getting the allocations right, and then creating financial sustainability through that.
I mean, one of the issues, comes back to debt. How much of our money do we spend on paying debt back? Because if we don't, we're going to end up having more debt later. That's quite a difficult task. I mean, there are many people, and I understand why they say this, accept their argument, sort of, that, we should actually take on more debt and end austerity, and yet that might create big problems down the line.
So the first thing is that, Treasury's trying to get a grip on it. We do spend a fifth of the budget on interest payments, which is a huge problem. And yes, debt is a problem when it's at this stage. You're going to have some debt. Look, it's a global problem, by the way. There have been a couple of financial crises, as we well know, in COVID. And so emerging markets and developing economies have the highest rate of debt that they've probably had in 50 years. So this is actually a global challenge across the world. The biggest issue, when people say debt doesn't matter and we can just spend our way to growth, that's true when you're spending effectively. But as the Treasury shows, public money is not spent with it doesn't have the performance that it needs to. At the most extreme is the spending that we saw in PRASA, where it's not just that it wasn't performing well, it took money out of the system and value. So it doesn't create growth unless we are turning the screws around accountability, leadership, and capability to deliver. If that were happening, then these are very good investments.
So in other words, if we're investing money and at the end of it we have a properly functioning railway system that is providing mass transport for a very cheap rate that improves people's lives and basically gets the economy functioning, well, that's a good investment. If the money is going to a group of people who are spending the wrong money on the wrong locomotives, well, that's a bad investment.
Sure, that's exactly right. And then it can be very growth-inducing, very job-creating. I used to do a lot of research when I was at the Human Sciences Research Council to say, how do you make an economy more employment-orientated? And, strengthening the passenger rail and passenger transport system, strengthening the freight transport system, and so forth is very employment-orientated in the economy. And yet, these are the things that aren't functioning as they need to be. Equally, if we had a well-functioning education system, well-functioning public health, things would be different even from an employment perspective.
The President was talking again today, so you and I have been discussing the budget, and he's been speaking, of course, so that came from the Finance Minister. The President's been delivering the ANC election manifesto today, and in the ANC's documents it says that over the next 5 years, the party will, and I'll quote, expand public employment to sustain 2.5 million work opportunities, delivering public goods and services in communities. Now, obviously, that would have an impact for the lives of those people who get those jobs or those work opportunities. would there also be a sort of multiplier effect? Would that be a sort of a good long-term investment in our economy if we have the money to do it?
So I think what he's talking about is stuff like the Presidential Youth Employment Initiative. That's been placing, as an example, one of the biggest parts of that has been placing teacher assistants, as an example. That kind of thing can be very helpful in schools and definitely have positive spin-offs. The amount of money that people earn, I'm not sure if it has an economic multiplier exactly, but it certainly has positive spin-offs, the kind of, early child development, teachers' aides, all of that kind of thing can be very beneficial. And I think that's what he's talking about there.
It's very tempting, of course, to say, well, one of the things that people who receive that money could do is, for example, fix potholes, and you'd sort of be spending money on infrastructure and on employing people. And I mean, we could have a big conversation around that, but that would be the kind of program I think many people might welcome.
Look, the National Development Plan, for better or for worse, that the state is meant to create an environment that is enabling of employment creation, and people should be able to make a plan within it. And the reality is in South Africa that it's very difficult to do so for for millions of people. It's just the simple present reality. So what we said, for better or for worse, was that public employment programs should at least be delivering to maybe half of those who are unemployed, at least maybe in current situation, 2 million employment opportunities a year. So it is aligned to the National Development Plan. But the most critical thing the state can do for employment creation is the kind of thing that I've been raising, is to make sure that our people are getting the kind of basic education they need to move on in their lives, that we have a very sick industrial workforce. We need better basic health services, even just clinic services. We need settlements that are densified so people are near opportunities and not so far away. We need a functioning passenger transport system that's integrated between taxi, rail, and bus. All of those, the freight transport system that's been falling apart, that's got to be functioning at least at a reasonable level. All of these things would be enabling of employment crowding in and starting to get hundreds of thousands of jobs being created each year. That's really the big ticket stuff that needs to happen.
There's a
but you've got to all of it at once. Sorry.
Sure. No. Okay, I think I heard you. Can't all happen at once. The other thing that this boils down to is competence in government. And it's tempting, Professor, to start a conversation around cadre deployment, but I'm going to put that to one side for a moment.
Thank you.
Because, what we see is claim after claim that government takes a very long time to do anything, whether that's drafting legislation, drafting regulations, making appointments. Making appointments to some positions at Eskom, for example. But there seems to be a situation where government almost just doesn't move. And I don't know why that is. I know that is a sort of government thing in many countries around the world. Governments usually aren't agile. Is there a particular problem in South Africa that the government just doesn't make decisions quickly and implement them properly?
So that's right. Every single person in the world feels their government doesn't run fast enough. Governments, by definition, are big bureaucracies. So let's just, lay that out. But the reality in South Africa right now is that there is a disjuncture between saying and doing. There's no doubt about that. And the critical element within that, and that's where I've really been focusing a lot of my work as a planning commissioner when I was one, and in the work I've been doing since then on infrastructure, is focused on these vexing issues of rebuilding institutions. It means strengthening leadership, strengthening the talent pipeline, performance management, all engagement with communities and the private sector to improve the way that these intersect. These are all about human capabilities that strengthen these institutions to deliver. That's really the core of what we have to be focusing on now.
Professor Miriam Altman, thank you. Professor of Practice at the University of Johannesburg. Really do appreciate that.